Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Whatever time you may be watching this, I hope that you're ready to listen. I am Dayan Lontak, and today we will be discussing the last topic for this semester for our subject Basic Microeconomics. But before we proceed, let me first introduce my co-discussants, Selwyn Andrade, Kisha Mago, Lara Paming, and Pauline May Angela Punsalan. So now, I think that you're all ready, so let's start this discussion. Today, since our topic is all about aggregate demand and aggregate supply equilibrium, we are going to talk about the price levels, the real GDP or gross domestic product, and of course, the changes due to the new economic policy. So this will include inflation, growth, and unemployment. So for example, kapag kataniasa ng government ang kanilang expenditure or the government spending, ibig sabihin magkakaroon ng shift sa aggregate demand papunta sa kanan or right, which would mean that there is an increased inflation, growth, and unemployment. So now there are two differences in the extreme cases from different views or perspective on the cause of unemployment. First, we have the Keynesian view, wherein they perceive unemployment as involuntary, and second is monetarist, wherein the view of unemployment is voluntary. So now, let's hear Selwyn Bon Andrade for a more detailed explanation on the extreme Keynesian case.
Increase in aggregate demand in extreme Keynesian case. In an extreme Keynesian case, an increase in aggregate demand would be achieved through a combination of fiscal and monetary policy. On the fiscal side, the government would increase government spending while cutting taxes. This would increase the aggregate demand by directly injecting money into the economy. On the monetary side, the government could decrease interest rates and increase the monetary supply to make the borrowing easier and cheaper. This would encourage greater spending and investments, further increasing aggregate demand. The aggregate supply is a horizontal unit until it reaches the point of full employment, where it becomes vertical. At aggregate demand 1, the output is below full employment. There is a deflationary gap between aggregate demand and the aggregate demand 1. On the vertical aggregate supply curve, which means that the equilibrium output is less than the full employment. Demand side policies can shift aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand. However, beyond that, there is no rise in output. There is just an increase in the inflation. There is an inflationary gap between aggregate demand and aggregate demand 2, the vertical distance on aggregate supply.
Good day everyone, I am Pauline May Angela Punsalan and I will be discussing with you the increase in aggregate demand in extreme monetarist case. So let us first define what it is. The extreme monetarist case reflects that an economy will always be at full employment at equilibrium. In other words, it pertains to an economy that is kept in balance when employment is full. As you can see in the figure, it only determines prices, and any increase in the aggregate demand will result in an increase in the rate of inflation. Now let's remember this. The increase in aggregate demand equals to increase in inflation rate or price level. Another thing is it means that only supply side policies can increase the real GDP. So what are supply side policies? Supply side policies are aimed at increasing aggregate supply based on the belief that higher rates of production will lead to higher rates of economic growth. Thus, full employment, meaning higher production rates, equates to economic growth or increase in real GDP. That is all. Thank you.
Hello, I am Lara. We will now discuss about the increase in aggregate demand in intermediate graph. But first, let's define what is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services in an economy. In addition, aggregate demand or AD refers to the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services in an economy. Strictly speaking, AD is what economists call total planned expenditure. We'll talk about that more in other articles, but for now, just think of aggregate demand as total spending. This demand is determined by a number of factors. One of them is the price level. An aggregate demand curve shows the total spending on domestic goods and services at each price level. Aggregate demand includes all four components of demand: consumption, investment, the third one, government spending, and lastly, net exports or exports minus imports. You can see an example of aggregate demand. The equilibrium is initially assumed at price 1 and year 1. An increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in real GDP from year 1 to year 2, but at the cost of an increase in the rate of inflation. It shows that growth can be increased at the expense of increasing inflation. The graph shows a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, showing that as the price level rises, the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services declines. The wealth effect holds that as the price level increases, the buying power of savings that people have stored up in bank accounts and other assets will diminish, eaten away to some extent by inflation. Because a rise in the price level reduces people's wealth, consumption spending will fall as the price level rises. Moreover, the interest rate effect explains that as the output rises, the same purchases will take more money or credit to accomplish. This additional demand for money and credit will push interest rates higher. In turn, higher interest rates will reduce borrowing by